Welcome and thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Today we're going to be talking about something I think is very interesting, especially for those of us holding on to jobs and trying to find ways to have sort of a tolerable relationship maybe between our coworkers and our bosses in case things go wrong. And that's simply known as resilience in the workplace. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is a guest we've had on our program before, Mr. Ed Farragon. He's going to be talking with us about what we can do and how this resilience actually works within our own minds. I'd like to welcome to our program our guest, Mr. Ed Farragon. Ed, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Hey, Dan. Good to see you again.
You bet. Now, why is resilience in the workplace so important, especially this day and age?
Well, the obvious is that things are changing so rapidly that it has people's heads spinning in the workplace. I work with an organization right now, and typically you work on 4 or 5 primary objectives. In this particular organization, which is like a division of a larger corporation, they have over 35 primary objectives that they're working on, which you can imagine the stress behind trying to work that kind of a magnitude of a workload. Mm-hmm. So more and more it's becoming a hot topic because people are having to do more with less time and with more on their plate.
Now, why is resilience in the workplace so important, and what is it?
Well, let's think about this for a minute. So imagine yourself at the job, and they keep piling stuff on. Okay. And what happens with that? As you know, Dan, I've been studying coaching for many, many years, and one of the dynamics that shows up is that people get overwhelmed and they get stressed, and then their performance is not as great. So I've done a lot of research in this area, and neuroscience has a lot of insight into what is actually going on in the nervous system when people get overwhelmed. And typically what happens, if you can imagine, trying to pour something down a funnel, and if you pour too much, it's going to overflow the funnel. Well, the same thing happens with information coming into our brains and our bodies, and that is we get overwhelmed. And so the overall objective is, one, to maintain a healthy person or employee or a leader or a manager, whoever it might be, and at the same time get work done that's realistic. Mm-hmm. And so building resilience in different employees or your workforce allows you to contend with these external forces and internal forces that are driving certain behaviors within the organization. And to be competitive on a global scale now, we have to look at all these resources that are out there for us.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting that you have businesses that really try to find ways to minimize cost while maximizing performance, and sometimes people just can't do everything like it is expected of them. I wonder what the thinking is behind that.
That's a really great observation, Dan, and I still scratch my head at some of the things I see. I've actually worked for organizations that they preach change management, and they send you to all these classes, but they don't know how to actually engage in it themselves. And one of the things that I've watched is people wanting to make global changes within the organization, but they don't know how to go out and do it step by step. So you get everybody on board, and so they actually want to be committed, and they feel excited about the new changes, and they really want to engage in such a way that's positive. And if you do it the right way, they'll actually work more hours without effort. I mean, they will just totally be happy and satisfied, and because they've gotten a path or a direction. So there's a couple of variables that are really important in all of this, and that is a person has to feel like they're informed on where they're going, whatever the change might be. They ideally like goals to be put in place, and then they want to know that they're competent to do the tasks that are necessary for these new changes that are going to be, happening.
I always find it interesting when you deal with a group of people that are going to implement a change, and they sit around and they talk about how great this change is going to be, but not a single one of them are really going to be involved in the process of what that change entails when it comes to the energy expended.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's so funny, they sit back there, and I fortunately, this part of my career, I've been invited into more of the upper level meetings. Mm-hmm. And I often ask them, I'll say, so here we've been talking for 6 hours. We've gone round and round about this topic of the change that you're wanting. Now, what do you think is going on in the minds of the people that were not in this meeting? They don't have a clue of all of the ideas and the thoughts that just got, that just unfolded through a rigorous dialogue. And they look at me like, oh, because what they do is they make a decision at the end of all that rigorous discussion and assuming that everybody's going to know what just took place in those meetings because, it took them a while. So people naturally want to orient themselves around change. They want to know what's going to happen here. What does it mean to me in my job, which triggers that insecurity around competency. What's going to happen to me in my job as you make these changes? And if they're part of those discussions, even if, I use the old trick, you find the person that's the most vocal in the organization, and you invite them to these meetings. Let's say you're going to make a change over a period of time. And you invite them to these meetings because what they'll do is they'll go out and they'll start preaching it, and they'll talk about it, and they'll start sharing the things they're learning. And what that's doing is it's actually orienting the workforce. So if you're not going to formally, overtly prepare people, then at least bring in some people that are going to talk about it.
Exactly. Kind of put them into the fold there. Now, how do you train people for resilience, and what does it look like?
Well, okay, that's a big subject, and we could talk for a few minutes about this because it's really an essential piece of understanding the psychology of change and understanding the psychology of how to prepare people for this change. Now, where do I begin? So we can start at some real basics. First of all, the organization has to be really clear what it is they're changing and why they're changing it and where they're going to go with it. And that, in turn, if they do it in a healthy way, dictates what's going to be the training. Okay? And put a note down here. And so what I do is I will listen really carefully. Let's say, for example, I would go in to do some training for resilience, I would figure out what is the magnitude of point A to point B being the goal that they're after and where they want to be in 5 years or in 1 year or 6 months, whatever the goal is. And then I ask a lot of questions around the magnitude of who's going to be impacted, what type of impact, what people, and then what's already on the schedules of these individuals that are going to have to start adjusting their calendars and their to-do list and all the projects they're working on, because it sends a ripple effect through the whole organization. Okay, so that's the first level, and then what I do is you meet with the highest level people, and you talk to them about the impact of this change, and find out from them how it's going to impact them. And you basically go through the same process, working your way down the levels of management in the organization. And as they express what it is the impact is going to be, what you're actually doing to their, I like to use the expression, to their nervous system, is you're preparing them for this change. And you're helping them to orient around what the change is going to be. And let me use a little analogy here that will help you understand the principles that are in force here. So imagine walking into the woods, and you're by yourself, and it's bear country, and whatever else is out there, and you're sitting down, you're getting ready to paint a painting, and all of a sudden you hear a stick crack in the distance. Well, what are you going to do? Your neck is going to go up, you're going to turn your head, and your ears are going to go on total focus, and you're going to be looking for a very primitive, you're actually going through a very primitive response, and you're going to be looking for, okay, is this animal going to eat me, or is it food for me? It's basically a very primitive response. And so you're scanning to see whether or not it's going to be safe. And then all of a sudden you look and you realize it's just a squirrel. Well, then the body calms down and you go back to painting. Well, it's no different with our nervous system in a workplace. So what we want to do is orient these people. We want to basically crack the stick in such a way that we say, oh, here we're going to break the stick, but we also want to let you know and help you to orient that we're not a big grizzly bear that's going to eat you alive, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's what we're really doing is we're working with that part of the nervous system that really wants to know that it's going to be safe. And so, we ask a lot of questions and get managers thinking about, okay, this is what this means, this is how it's going to affect me, and there'll be resistance, which is normal in every situation. Mm-hmm. And you want to be able to be prepared for that kind of resistance. And so you ask questions like, so how should we prepare for this knowing what we know? And there'll be some grumbling, but then people will start coming up with answers. And that's one of the key secrets is you want to move them through the phase of the initial reaction into taking action as quickly as possible. And now let me share with you a couple of coaching tips around individuals themselves. They'll have one of two primary orientations, and this has been researched very thoroughly. They'll either have what we call an internal locus of control, or they'll have an external locus of control. Now, an external is where you think that other people cause your pain. Mm-hmm. In this case, the leaders of the organization are causing them the pain, right?
Sure.
An internal locus of control is somebody that goes, wow, I could react to this, or I could get busy and find some solutions. And somebody that has that internal locus of control will be much more agile through this change than people that have an external locus of control. The people that have an external locus of control actually tap into what I see coaching people over and over again is a very old pattern that is established early in life where they actually felt like they were victims and they had no control, and they probably got traumatized over and over again around being helpless around some kind of issue from authority figures, right? Mm-hmm. So that becomes engaged, that becomes activated. So you need ways of working with those kind of people because they end up being the hardest part of the whole change process. And one of the ways you do that is you help them to educate themselves around what their own internal locus of control is. And there's exercises you can do to help raise their awareness, like, oh my gosh, I didn't even, realize that I think this way. And just the pure awareness that, I'm oriented towards the negative versus the positive, I'm oriented towards complaining versus finding solutions, it just changes the whole landscape. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if you push back at those people and you say, just get over it, and then they get resentful and, you got a whole other slew of problems on your hands. So training is a really, it's a really important piece of it when it's done right. And it can be done in such a way that you move through the transition of change, fairly quickly when you orient people in a really effective manner. And that's, of course, the goal of the training. Mm-hmm. Is that as clear as mud?
It seems pretty clear to me. I was just thinking while you were describing all that about situations I'd been in over the years in different work environments, and the boss may come along and there may be a group of people who say, why don't we find a little special project to kind of keep us all busy? So, he'd find different things for different people to do. It could be anything from wiping down a wall to cleaning a shelf, whatever the case is. And what I always found funny about that were the people that would start sniveling and whining about it, that weren't doing anything in the first place. Right. And, I kept thinking to myself, just get it done for one thing. But the other thing, too, is it takes less time to actually do it than it does to stand around and complain about it, and it gives you something to do, And so what the thinking is behind the people that complain when they're in a situation like that.
Right. And, really what's happening there is they're uncomfortable. And if you break it down to the neuroscience of what's happening and you hook them up to machines, you'll actually see their nervous system going bonkers. Uh-huh. they're just really super uncomfortable because their nervous system has never been trained to handle ambiguity or change in such a way that they feel threatened, especially in today's job market. People are being traumatized left and right because they're forced into some of these changes, and they feel helpless with the response to it because the leaders of the organizations don't know how to engage people in such a way that they empower them, and they don't understand how it disempowers them by the way they go about it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a really good book out. It's called The Leadership Pipeline. And one of the things that he talks about, there's actually several authors of that book. Ram Charan is one of them. But one of the things they talk about is the values that you have to change as you move up the ladder in management, leadership. And one of those values, and I emphasize this over and over because I've seen it so many times working with leaders, that sometimes you'll hear the excuse, well, they were hired to do a job, they should just do it.
Right.
Well, that's an excuse of not being competent to help people accomplish what they're trying to do. Mm-hmm. And the fundamental flaw in that is the value, one of the values that a person that becomes a manager or a leader, they have to take on the value of helping people to be successful. And so from a resiliency standpoint, if I'm a leader in an organization and I have this high value for making sure, Dan, if you're my employee, that you're successful, you're going to calm down anyway in your body because you trust that I'm looking out for your best interest. It really goes back to even a fundamental principle that we were all raised with, is to the degree that our parents covered our back as children.
I find it interesting that there's still management out there, and it's really can be found in just about any business. It doesn't really matter where it is, that have this old school, I guess if you want to call that, attitude about managing people. I'm the manager, do what I say, and then the next thing the employee's in between, let's say, a customer and the manager, so they're in between a rock and a hard place, no matter what happens. And they can't understand why, their employees, if you will, the subordinates, have such a sour attitude toward what they're doing. They can't seem to see that they are really the problem, that what you're doing is you're setting me up to be unsuccessful. And then you're going to go ahead and you're going to tear into me once you've proved that that's right.
Right. And 9 out of 10 times, there was a book written, 20, 30 years ago called The Peter Principle. And what happens is companies grow, they start getting bigger, but they don't plan for building resilience or building leadership skills or management skills into the people that are targeted for promotion. Mm-hmm. And what they do is they make an ad hoc decision all of a sudden that says, oh, we got to add a new manager in this position, or they lose somebody and they need a replacement. Well, they never prepared themselves to have the bench strength to replace that person. So they just go to somebody, and this is very prevalent in the engineering world, high-tech world, where there's a lot of engineers. And what you'll get is a really smart engineer, very intelligent, and they're nice. They're really nice. And because they're nice, they think, oh, this person will make a great manager. And so they promote them into management, and the person has no clue how to manage people. Mm-hmm. Very good technically. And in fact, they'll lean towards micromanaging because they're not sure exactly how to relate to people. Right.
Yeah, in fact, that's exactly the scenario that I was pointing out, is the fact that, that you may promote somebody out of a group of people that you were as part of that subordinate group to become their leader, if you will. And then you say, as you were just saying, then they begin to micromanage it. It's like, just because you know how the job is done doesn't mean that you know how to manage people. And there's a difference between those two things.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah,
I don't know how many times I've actually called managers on the carpet and say, somebody needs to train you how to be a better manager because your leadership skills, quite frankly, suck. And sometimes they just don't want to hear that, but I know the difference, So,
right.
Anyway.
Yeah, I've coached a lot of people that were in that situation. I had an experience many years ago where I had a high-level leader that was a Stanford grad, and he used to describe the CEO that would run these meetings as getting baseballs thrown at him.
Uh-huh.
And he couldn't keep up with, blocking the balls coming at him, right? And I asked him one day, I said, so here you are, you have this knowledge. I said, have you thought about, and of course he was a conflict-adverse person, so he would attract that kind of person to him, right? That's just kind of the way it works with us.
Mm-hmm.
And so I coached him. I said, let's imagine for a moment that I'm him and you're you. What would you say to me if you really wanted to share your thoughts about this global worldwide marketing program that you think they should migrate toward? And so we practiced it a few times, and then finally, about the third day that we practiced for a couple hours at a time, I said, okay, I think you're ready. I want you, for your homework, I want you to go talk to your boss about this. Well, because of the approach that he used, based on the assumptions that him and I talked about, he changed the way he was thinking about going in and talking to this leader and this manager. And the way he went about it, he got the attention of this manager. Mm-hmm. And he said, I think we're going to do this. And they ended up actually implementing the program that he had in fact, he was getting ready to leave the company. That's how unhappy he was, as well as frustrated that he didn't feel like he was contributing as much as he could. Well, there's a perfect example where the leader, sucked at their job, and at the same time, the employee came back in a positive way, and it just so happened that he had some coaching, so I think that helped. Mm-hmm. But he came back in a positive way, in such a way that he got the attention of this person and opened up their perspective as a new way of looking at something. Mm-hmm. And it turned out to be a brilliant move. In fact, his career just shot up, after that. And his confidence grew, his confidence mm-hmm. as a contributor.
Now, what kind of companies are successful doing this?
Well, it's I haven't seen a lot of them, but then again, the reason people call in consultants is because they're usually missing that skill set or they're missing those competencies. But the ones that I think are successful are people that realize that it's a very important piece of change to have people that are resilient in the organization. I want to mention years ago there was a movement called emotional intelligence in the workplace,
right? Which
is still popular today, and even resiliency is linked to that, because one of the core practices of resiliency is to be able to emotionally handle stuff without falling apart, right?
Right.
And to be able to keep moving forward when times are tough, and that's a cornerstone of resilience. So companies that recognize that there's a need for change, and that especially if it's going to be intense change, that if they pull in a consultant or coaches or tap into the collective management or leadership that understands how to change and puts a plan together to change, they'll have much, much better results. Mm-hmm. So I would say companies that, one, have gone through it before and they realize it doesn't work to not prepare people, and companies that don't force it down people's throat, they're going to be much more successful than people that just say, okay, we got to do this to survive. And not that can't work sometimes when a company is on the brink of disaster, but it's not the best way to do it by any stretch of the imagination. Yeah.
Now, Ed, how can people find out more about what you do and how perhaps you can actually work with companies? Because this day and age, there are more people now starting businesses than have in the last 15 years. And, certainly anybody who's been, let's say, an employee for somebody else has a great idea, says, I'm going to go out with this and I'm going to start a business and perhaps hire some people. Just going into business for yourself requires tremendous personal change. But then if you plan on being in this business where you have people working for you, that's even bigger.
Right. Well, ask the question again, Dan. I want to make sure.
The question is how can people find out more about what you have to offer? Where can they find out more information about that?
Well, one, I can obviously talk to people about it further, and my website, of course, at edfarragon.com. There's some information out there. I've written a couple of blogs about it in the past. But it's really a discussion, and there's a couple of great books. One is called The Resiliency Advantage. Unfortunately, the author of that, he's actually from Portland, believe it or not, where we're from. He died here in the last couple of years, which was a tragic loss because he was such a major contributor to the resiliency field. Mm-hmm. And that was Al Siebert. And so that's a fabulous book to give you some preparation. Another good one, and I'm forgetting the author at this moment, but it's called Resiliency at Work. And I love that book. That was based on a study when AT&T split apart. Uh-huh. This guy went in with a bunch of students, and they studied the organization for, I want to say 5 to 10 years about resiliency and change and what happens and what worked and what didn't work. And so you get another perspective of a real-life scenario, and it's written extremely well. So those are two resources. And then there's a pretty good program out there. It's one that I'm familiar with is Bridges Transitions Training by William Bridges. He wrote a great book called Transitions. And that's another good book to give you some insight. But, one of the things I did, which I think makes me unique, is that I went further and I started studying neuroscience. And I wanted to understand basically the neuroscience behind change. When I did my master's program, I did it around defensiveness to learning, which is closely related to this whole resiliency thing. And so I've gone into understanding the actual neuroscience behind the safety system that's built into the human, psyche, which is part of our biology, and understanding, what is really going on here at a core level. And then from that place, you can really come up with the fundamental principles to think about change coming from a neuroscience place versus, one author telling you one thing and another telling you another. Because sometimes it's hard to make sense out of why you're doing what you're doing. But when you understand the neuroscience behind it, and I have a really good model, I call it the activation regulation cycle model. And when I show it to people, it makes it crystal clear. Like, okay, when novelty comes into my environment, I get activated, and then if I'm competent, I can maintain a good, healthy, activation or a nervousness, whatever you want to call it, that's healthy and keeps me challenged. But as soon as I start reaching a place of overwhelm, then I'm going to start going into coping mechanisms, and then you lose people. You get defensive behavior, you get ADD symptoms, you get complaining, whining, the whole 9 yards, and you don't want that. So, that's one of the things I bring to it from my own perspective, of what I've learned about it.
Interesting stuff. So is there a website people can go and find out more about your work?
Yeah, just edfarragon.com.
It seems simple enough.
And the first page, if you click on a business, there's a plug there, a little link that says business. I have two parts of my website. I work with individuals around resiliency, and I work with organizations. When you go into edfarragon.com, you land on the homepage, which is just my regular website for individuals, and then you'll see a link to businesses, and then there's some information there as well.
Well, very good, Ed. Thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
You bet. Thanks for having me, Dan.
You betcha. We also encourage you to visit edfarragon.com, especially if you're one of those considering not only going into business for yourself, but probably bringing in some people to help you be successful as well. Remember, that's where it starts. We also encourage you to visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com. That's the number 50. Sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. We thank you again for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis, and remember, live your day past halfway.